Today is June 25th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to start, as I usually do, by looking at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is pro-Ukrainian, so just keep that in mind when we take a look at it. As you can see, along the line of contact, Ukraine's long-anticipated offensive, it is now in its fourth week. It is nearing the 1-month mark, and despite putting these rifle icons on the map and indicating these little bites out of the line of contact, there is relatively no progress being made by Ukrainian forces. And if we zoom out, we can see that they were also following the drama yesterday in Russia regarding the Wagner private military company. I'll get into that in just a moment. But as you can see, things are not going very well along the line of contact. The Wagner drama was a well-welcomed distraction from the ongoing Ukrainian offensive. And I just want to show you what they had been saying as the offensive began and where it is right now. So here is a DW interview with U.S. Army General David Petraeus, former U.S. Army General. The spring offensive will be much more successful than many think. This is what former U.S. Army General David Petraeus said, and more specifically, he talked about Russian defenses.
I think the Russians will prove to be more brittle than the expectation is. Keep in mind, these units have been in combat for over a year, many of them. They have not been pulled offline to reconstitute by having forces replaced, equipment replaced and repaired, and then doing training before they go back. They just get individual replacements to fill the gap. They're not well trained, they're not well equipped, they're not well led. And I think that these Ukrainian forces, which are well trained, are well equipped, we are going to break through. And then you might see a real dynamism to the battlefield that could give real opportunities to the Ukrainians to explore.
So we go from Russian defenses being very brittle, manned by poorly trained, poorly led conscripts, to this from the Wall Street Journal. This is all Western media. This is from June 10th. About a week into the offensive, the Wall Street Journal: a wall of steel. Ukrainian troops face hard slog in offensive's first days. Brigades with Western arms make small gains against Russia's defensive lines in occupied regions. The article goes on and it says, the plan to push south toward the Russian-occupied town of Tokmak in the southern Zaporozhye region, according to a soldier who was part of the operation. Two other units would also push toward Tokmak from different axes. As soon as the regiment crossed a road outside of the town of Mala Tokmak, the 28-year-old soldier said the Russians began to pummel them with Grad rockets. The fields were mined. Russian helicopters and jets fighters buzzed overhead. The assault progressed less than 2 miles, the soldier said. One of the Leopards was hit and disabled. They were just waiting for us, prepared positions everywhere, he said. It was a wall of steel. It was horrendous. Several days into Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive aimed at taking back land occupied by Russia, the scale of the challenge that Ukrainian troops face is already clear. Russian forces have spent months, and more specifically over half a year, preparing for attacks in occupied parts of the country's south, where the Ukrainians would like to push through and cut the land bridge that connects Russia to Crimea, which Moscow seized in 2014. Videos posted on social media have appeared to show the loss of a few Leopard tanks and several US-made Bradley fighting vehicles in the southern Zaporozhye region, where flat open fields offer almost no cover for an attacking force. And this is pretty much how the offensive has gone on ever since this article was written, up to and including today. We're still seeing footage of German Leopard tanks being destroyed, burning, abandoned on the battlefield, along with heaps of US Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, M113s, and all of the other equipment the West transferred to Ukraine ahead of this offensive. Now, let's see what Russia is saying. That's That is the Western media. Wall Street Journal is Western media. What does the Russian media say? This is TASS, Russian state media. Ukrainian troops understand they don't stand a chance against Russian forces. Putin. And in this article, he talks about some of the Ukrainian losses. This was June 21st, so much more recent than the Wall Street Journal article. As of today, we see that the enemy's offensive potential has not been depleted yet. The enemy has reserves, and it thinks where and how to use them. Speaking about the destroyed Western vehicles, Putin underscored that these numbers keep growing. How much? That would require a look at the numbers. The total, as of last night, was 245 tanks and 678 armored vehicles of various types. Of course, that includes Leopards, French-wheeled vehicles, US-made armored vehicles, everything, the president said. They burn quite well. And to put that number of 245 tanks into perspective, let's look at this much older CNN article. West to deliver 321 tanks to Ukraine, says Diplomat. So 321 tanks were sent to Ukraine. And the article actually says the figure comes after the US this week pledged to provide 31 M1 Abrams tanks, and Germany agreed to send 14 Leopard 2A6s. Previously, the United Kingdom had pledged 14 Challenger 2 tanks, while Poland has asked for approval from Germany to transfer some of its own German-made Leopard 2s to Ukraine. So this number of 321 tanks includes tanks that haven't even been delivered to Ukraine yet. There are Leopard 1 tanks that haven't been delivered to Ukraine yet, about 100 of them at least. The Leopard 1 tank is even less suitable for the conditions that are on the battlefield that the much more modern and capable Leopard 2 clearly cannot overcome. Even before the offensive began, I have been talking about Ukraine's artillery ammunition shortage. I have been talking about that for months because the Western media has been talking about it for months. This is a problem they cannot resolve. The United States and Europe combined cannot produce enough artillery ammunition for Ukraine to even meet its rate of fire before the offensive began, which was about 6,000 rounds a day. They cannot even match that. For this offensive, the US and Europe had reserves of ammunition stored away for their own use for any type of emergency or contingency. They reached into that and they have supplied Ukraine with a significant amount of ammunition. How much exactly is unknown, but it would have been much larger than the amounts they have been previously given Ukraine. I suspect they have between 1 to 2 months worth of ammunition that was handed over to them in that tranche. And then after that, they are going to, again, rely on the West to provide them ammunition as fast as they can make it, which is not a lot. It is not a lot at all. As a matter of fact, by 2 to 3 years from now, the US and Europe, if their plans are successful to expand artillery ammunition production, they may actually be able to make enough artillery rounds per month to supply Ukraine with the 6,000 a day that they need, which, by the way, is far fewer than the amount of rounds Russia uses per day. And Russia's ammunition production is already larger now than the US and Europe's combined production will be 2 to 3 years after they are done expanding it. Just to give you an idea of how this is playing out. This is a war of attrition. It is not a war for territory. But that is what Ukraine is attempting to do with this offensive, to gain territory at the expense of all of this limited and dwindling equipment that they are being given by the West. And then a much more recent article, right before this Wagner drama began unfolding, there was this from the BBC. Just 3 days ago, Ukraine war, Zelensky admits slow progress, but says offensive is not a movie. And this is the realization that all of the hype before the offensive was public relations, propaganda, delusion, and now reality is setting in. It is not that easy to just cross layers and layers of prepared defenses laid out by a force that has been preparing for this offensive over half a year ago, starting half a year ago or longer. Obviously, the offensive is not going as planned, and for those who were paying attention to preparations on both sides would have realized that Actually, it would never go as planned if the plan was to take huge amounts of territory and push Russia out of what Ukraine claims is their territory. Because even if they do manage to take large amounts of territory, by the time this offensive ends, wherever it ends on the map, they're going to be exhausted, depleted, and does not have the ability to reconstitute their decimated forces. Because of this reality, and people beginning to understand and grasp this reality, we've seen growing desperation as the offensive grinds on. We've seen calls to send all sorts of super weapons, and we've seen even this from CNN. Ukrainian pilots plead for F-16s as they battle Russian air superiority. Well, we were told that Russian weapons were terrible and that this really wasn't an issue. Now, obviously it is. Russia was playing the long game. They systematically dismantled Ukraine's air defenses, and now they're able to use their military aviation to greater effect. And what has been transferred to Ukraine so far is inadequate, and they admit that. Here's another article, very telling, and gives us a little bit of insight into these plans to send F-16s and train Ukrainian pilots. This is from Politico. U.S.-trained Ukrainian pilot who died in combat had been eager to get back into the fight. This is about a Ukrainian pilot who was in the United States training for 2 years, and he died on his first mission returning to Ukraine. He was trained for 2 years by the U.S. Air Force, and he died on his very first mission having returned to Ukraine. What makes people think that some sort of, and he was flying a warplane that he was familiar with and had years of experience on, what makes the West believe that abbreviated training on an airframe Ukrainians have never used before, what makes them think that's going to turn out any different? It's not going to. It was the same with these Western tanks. Everyone was saying these tanks will be a game changer. They're vastly superior to Russian main battle tanks. It will give a huge advantage to the Ukrainians, but back in reality, there was never enough time to fully integrate these new weapon systems into Ukrainian military forces. It takes years to do that successfully, to do that effectively. They abbreviated the training. They've sent a hodgepodge of equipment. It wasn't even just one type of NATO main battle tank. They sent a multitude of main battle tanks, all requiring different ammunition, different maintenance requirements, different training requirements. And this inhibits Ukraine's ability to use these on the battlefield effectively. There's a reason why armies standardize their equipment. It's to streamline logistics, which is the most important aspect of fighting any war. And again, I'm going to get into that topic a little bit more when we talk about Wagner and the supposed civil war that was supposed to unfold. The offensive is grinding on. There are huge losses for Ukraine. We're beginning to hear increasingly desperate and irrational calls for additional super weapons to be transferred. I've talked about the F-16s, the ATACMS. They've got the Storm Shadow that they've pinned all of their hopes on. We're even hearing people talk about a direct Western military intervention because they understand that the F-16s is going to play out exactly how the Leopard 2 tanks played out. I've even talked about an op-ed by someone, one of these senior fellows at one of these US government and industry funded think tanks, talking about sending nuclear weapons to Ukraine. This is how desperate they're getting. And with all of this desperation, growing desperation in mind, this Wagner drama unfolds. Now, I'm not calling it a civil war. A civil war is impossible. A civil war requires a divided nation, and not just a nation divided politically, but a nation that's divided in terms of industry, economy, institutions, militarily. The US Civil War, for example, you had the Union, multiple states with their own economies, all grouped together, their collective industrial output. They had a military, they had institutions, they had governments, national and local, and so did the Confederacy. Only the Confederacy had less industry. They had a smaller industrial output. They were not able to produce the type of equipment that they needed, nor the quantity that they needed, and that is why they lost. And for Russia, to have a civil war, they would need to be divided in a very similar way, which today is absolutely impossible. It could never happen. There is no way to trigger some sort of civil war inside of Russia. It is just an absolute absurdity. It cannot happen. And so keep that in mind when we look at articles like this from The Atlantic. This is Anne Applebaum. She has contributed to very large newspapers, Washington Post. She's been on the board of directors of the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. And she wrote this article, which I bet she really regrets today. In hindsight, Russia slides into civil war. Is Putin facing his Tsar Nicholas II moment? And in the very first paragraph, she says, the hall of mirrors that Vladimir Putin has built around himself and within his country is so complex and so multi-layered that on the eve of a genuine insurrection in Russia, I doubt very much if the Russian president himself believed it could be real. And in reality, what we see is Anne Applebaum and the U.S. establishment in their own little hall of mirrors. It's not in Moscow. It is most certainly in Washington. The idea that Russia was sliding into a civil war because a couple hundred mercenaries parked their vehicles outside a military building in Rostov, and a small convoy of mercenaries were trying to travel to Moscow, that this was going to result in civil war was utterly absurd. I'm going to give a real quick summary of what happened just in case. We had Wagner figurehead. He's not really the commander of Wagner. He's more of a figurehead. Yevgeny Prigozhin. He brought an unspecified number of Wagner fighters to Rostov very early in the morning. This is in southern Russia. And so we saw a lot of people in the Western media and commentators claiming that Wagner captured Rostov. They didn't capture Rostov. The Russian military at that time had no orders to stop them. They were parking their vehicles there. They were not taking over anything. And even Prigozhin himself came out and made a point to say that nothing that they are doing is obstructing the operations related to the special military operation ongoing in Ukraine. Now, I still don't know how many fighters were involved. Prigozhin said he had up to 25,000 Wagner fighters under his commands, but looking at Telegram, looking at the visual evidence, I saw evidence of maybe 1 or 2 battalions most, and that's between 500 to 1,000 men per battalion. So we're talking about an absolute maximum of 2,000 fighters. But I could be wrong. There could have been many more involved. I just didn't see any visual evidence of that. And while in Rostov, Wagner, Prigozhin, and the Wagner fighters that joined him, they demanded all of these changes in the Ministry of Defense, and they claimed that they were going to march for justice on Moscow. Before noon, Moscow time, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave a public address condemning all of this as treachery. And the article will be in the video description below. You could read about it. This is TASS, Russian state media. Russia will defend itself from internal treachery, says Putin. He categorically condemned what Prigozhin and Wagner were doing, and he told them to stop. And when he said this, this dashed all hopes for Prigozhin. Let me explain. A lot of Western commentators were acting as if Wagner had some sort of ability to wage war against the rest of Russia. It's impossible. The Wagner fighters are supported by the Ministry of Defense. They receive arms and ammunition from the Russian military. They do not have their own supply chain. They don't have their own warehouses. They are supplied from warehouses controlled by the Russian military. When they decided to act against the Russian state, all of that support would have been cut off. So they would have only had the weapons and ammunition they had on hand. They would not receive any more supplies, food, water, medical supplies, fuel for their vehicles, spare parts for their vehicles. Absolutely everything you need for sustained combat was completely cut off. So they had a handful of fighters, a very small, finite amount of ammunition and supplies and fuel to do something with, and they were going against the entire Russian state. Prigozhin, in his mind, when he was setting all of this up in the morning, probably thought when he declared his March for Justice, very high-level military and political leaders would side with him. They did not. And when Russian President Vladimir Putin gave his speech, categorically condemning what he did, absolutely no one was going to side with him. Number one, they're not going to act against the Russian president. Prigozhin himself was making a point of not acting against the Russian president. They're also not going to side with someone who's clearly going to lose, and lose in less than 24 hours. If this turned ugly and extensive fighting took place, this would have been over 24 hours, maybe 48 hours max. When Russian President Vladimir Putin made his speech, that was a message to Prigozhin that if he continued, this would be suicide. So by evening, not even 24 hours into this, the president of Belarus negotiated with Prigozhin, got him to stop. Prigozhin claimed he had reached within 200 kilometers of Moscow, which is really not that close. And he ordered the Wagner fighters involved to return to their camps. Prigozhin has to now go to Belarus, basically live in exile. Wagner is going to finish the process of being incorporated into the Ministry of Defense, which was a process that was already ongoing, and most likely the trigger for Prigozhin to attempt this stunt. As I discussed in a live stream hosted by Alex of Reportify Media, I'll put the link to this discussion in the video description below. I was joined by Angelo Giuliano and Carl Za. There was this history of Prigozhin complaining, doing rash things to get attention, to get the Ministry of Defense to respond and react to him, to get the Russian government to respond and react to him. And I believe that this, he thought in his mind, was the next logical step, and he maybe in his mind thought it was a calculated risk. It turned out to be a blunder. During the live stream, Carl made a couple of really good points too. He was talking about how Prigozhin had no air support. So essentially, he was on a suicide mission. If he decided to continue and the Russian government decided to liquidate him and the fighters that joined him, that's what would have happened. Wagner didn't stand a chance. He talked about how if you really wanted effective coup and you had limited resources, you had no air cover, you didn't have mountains of ammunition, you would have to already be in Moscow and launch it almost instantaneously. Starting out in Rostov and traveling to Moscow was so ill-conceived. This is why a lot of people suspected maybe it was some sort of psychological operation. It just made so little sense. Angelo made the points, and I also heard this point made by the Duran, Alex Christoforo, and Alexander Mercuris, who had spot-on analysis as well throughout the day yesterday. They talked about how this, if anything, if any damage was done, it was done diplomatically between Russia and its allies and its potential allies. I believe that China is in this with Russia to the end. No matter what happens, I believe they fully understand their fate is entirely tied to Russia. And so something like this is not going to sway them. But there are nations on the fence, nations that could potentially join Russia, China, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that might think twice now, having seen this, despite it being resolved so quickly. So that is the potential damage that could have been done to Russia. Otherwise, this was done in less than 24 hours. A lot of these commentators, analysts, journalists, they know nothing about how the real world works. They don't have real jobs. They've spent their entire life in academia, in politics, in their offices, doing their journalism. They've never had a real job. They don't understand how industry or military matters work. They know nothing about this. A lot of their understanding of how these things work come from Hollywood movies, which is why they ignored the logistics of Wagner's situation, and they deferred to some sort of Hollywood-style plot where somehow a handful of mercenaries could travel hundreds of kilometers, somehow refuel, somehow get more ammunition, somehow fight off Russian military aviation when they themselves had no air support, and get into Moscow and somehow affect regime change or rearrange the Ministry of Defense at will. It was an utter fantasy. This all stems from a very deep desire from within the Western establishment itself, where foreign policy is talked about and formed. They have a deep and long-standing desire to divide and destroy both Russia and China. And I've talked at length about China. I've shown State Department documents talking about encircling and containing China, stretching all the way back to the end of World War II, how they focused on Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and they've done this through armed violence as well throughout the years. And obviously in Russia. So look at this. This is from the US government-funded organization called the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the US Helsinki Commission. And this is a June 23rd, 2022 event called Decolonizing Russia. Here's the About page, just in case you don't believe that it's funded by the US government. And here is an article about the same topic. This is from Foreign Policy magazine. And there's other articles that have covered this very recently, since the special military operation began, because this is one of their last hopes. This is April 2023. And this is what the Foreign Policy article talks about. The West is preparing for Russia's disintegration. Western analysts are increasingly pushing the theory that Russia disintegrating is coming, and that the West must not only prepare to manage any possible spillover of the ensuing civil wars, but also to benefit from the fracture by luring resource-rich successor nations into its ambit. They argue that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the West was blindsided and failed to fully capitalize on the monumentous opportunity to divide, destroy, exploit, and absorb Russia, to conquer Russia, essentially. This is what they're openly admitting in their articles and their op-eds. And it says it must now strategize to end the Russian threat once and for all, instead of providing an off-ramp to Putin. And the West is openly doing this, which is why the West should know that Russia is never going to negotiate with them, because the West will never negotiate in good faith. Their ultimate goal is the subjugation of Russia, and Russia knows it. So now you can see why the collective West was so excited about Prigozhin and Wagner parking some army vehicles outside an office building in Rostov, and why, despite all of the facts pointing elsewhere, they hoped and dreamed that this was going to lead to a civil war, the division and destruction of Russia, rather than a very decisive move made by the Kremlin to end this in less than 24 hours, which is exactly what happened. So for now, it's over. Russian President Vladimir Putin has not only solved this crisis in less than 24 hours, he has finally answered the Wagner question. What will happen with Wagner? What will happen with Prigozhin, who had repeatedly created unnecessary tension and distractions away from the main focus, which is Russia fighting the collective power of NATO in this proxy war they're waging on Russia in Ukraine. And this should be the main focus of everyone in Russia, and everyone who understands the danger that NATO has posed to the world and continues to pose to the world. For all of these pundits and commentators in the West cheering on Prigozhin and Wagner and hoping for the division and destruction of Russia, all that euphoria, that has faded. Now they're back to their regular routine of watching NATO tanks and armored vehicles get destroyed along the line of contact, a relatively unchanged line of contact, as Ukraine's offensive nears the 1 month mark. And getting back to the offensive, because that is where the main focus should be. As President Putin himself said in this TASS article, much of Ukraine's offensive potential remains, and they need to figure out what they're going to do with it. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on all of that. Again, and as I have said before the offensive ever began, nobody should underestimate what Ukraine is capable of doing. People who think that Ukraine isn't going to break through at all, I think that's very unrealistic. I think that they will. I had said before the offensive began that I believe Russian forces are prepared to fall back considerably in the Donbas region, I believe they're prepared to fall all the way back to Popasnaya, which means allowing Ukraine to take back Bakhmut, essentially. If Ukraine is unable to do any of that, to make any sort of territorial gain, even though it means the complete destruction of this offensive potential that they've built up over the last half year, that means things are much worse for Ukraine than even I understand. So I will keep an eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I have begun posting all of my YouTube videos on Telegram directly. You can use your smartphone to watch the video. You can shut the screen off while it's playing and it'll continue playing without your screen being on. That's something that YouTube doesn't allow you to do unless you have YouTube Premium. So I suggest people take advantage of that. Also in the video description are all of the links to everything that I've referenced, as well as for ways you can support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It doesn't help me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. The links to both of those and several other options are in the video description below. And to everyone who has been helping me out, whether it's a one-time donation, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with other people, that is what makes this work possible. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching.